Hi everyone. So this week is our last case study discussion post, and this week we are talking about how Chapter 11 of our text relates to the Hockaday responders case study. And our first question is, how is or should strategic communication be used in the Hockaday case? First of all, I do think that the Hockaday responders used some strategic communication over the course of the situations discussed in our case. The text defines strategic communication as a series of transactional communication processes based on deliberately constructed organizational messages and responses to stakeholder inputs. I would say that Jim's deliberately constructed PR messages to let people know what was going on with the issue in the U.S. city and what was being done to prevent further issues in the European city was definitely an example of strategic communication. Jim deliberately constructed the messages and distributed them to the media companies so that people would hear about what was going on and would be aware of the situation. I think that their timing on delivering the strategic communication was a little bit delayed, and I think they could have spoken with stakeholders a little bit sooner about the issue and helped alleviate fears before they were posted publicly or anything like that. I think that the Hockaday responders needed to develop a better communication strategy with some of their publics, specifically with their employees. It seems like Jill and the upper management team didn't really communicate a lot with the virtual team members before the issue happened in the U.S. city. It seemed like they kind of left them on their own to figure things out, and I think that better communication and structure there would have definitely helped in resolving the issue in the U.S. city sooner, and would have alleviated people's fears that the same issue would happen in the European city. I think that they kind of took a non-communication approach when it came to their employees and expected them to figure it out on their own and manage themselves, but I think they did need to take a little bit bigger role in the whole thing and communicate more often and more strategically with their employees. I think question 2 is, what are things Jill should consider for strategic communication? I think that first of all, she should consider better communication with publics, including outside stakeholders and internal stakeholders. I think the main outside stakeholders that they need to communicate better with are the companies that use their product or their service. I think that they should have communicated better with the U.S. city during the crisis situation, should have figured out a way to communicate well with them and not left it all up to the virtual team. I think that Francois and the other members of the virtual team that were communicating with the U.S. city did not do a very good job, and that there should have been a better structure in place for handling that. I think that they also should have had a action plan for communicating with other companies that used their technology, so that they could let them know, hey, this is what happened in the U.S. city, here's what we're doing to resolve it, and so on. That way they could alleviate the other cities and other technology users' fears about the same situation happening to them. I think that they could have done a lot to communicate better with the outside stakeholders. As far as internal stakeholders go, I definitely think that they needed to communicate better with employees. They didn't do a very good job of this, and definitely had a lot of room for improvement, which I've already discussed and I'm going to continue discussing later on. I think that they also needed to do some better environment scanning and gathering information about the environment. I think that Jill kind of started this process when she evaluated the changes the company needed to make and when she implemented the virtual team, but I don't think that she continued that process afterwards, and I think that that's something she should have done. I think another thing Jill should consider is the SWOT processes for change, as discussed in section 11.3.4. I think that conducting a SWOT analysis on the changes in the first place would have definitely helped them to assess strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the changes, and kind of make a action plan for how to handle all of those situations. Jill did seem to identify the strengths of a virtual team, but I don't think she identified the weaknesses or the threats that the virtual team structure might pose. I think she definitely could have done a lot to improve the change process, and that the SWOT analysis would have been very useful for implementing the changes in structure and moving towards the virtual team. I think that another area Jill should consider is the internal communications, as discussed by the text in section 11.4.3. Internal communications is simply defined as employee communications. It says that this element can involve seeking input from employees, communicating the organizational or the organization's mission, and establishing communication structures. I don't think that any of these tasks were done very well. I think that Jill needed to seek better input from the employees. She kind of did, in the surveys, seek information from the employees, but she didn't seek input from the employees before implementing the virtual team, which could have been very helpful. And she didn't seek input directly from the employees during the crisis situation. She only sought input from them afterwards during the hot wash sessions. I don't know what necessarily the organization's mission was. It doesn't seem like Jill and the upper management team communicated that to the virtual team members, and I think that if that had been communicated better, they would have had a better sense of what the organization's goals were and how they should be handling things. It also can be a source of motivation, so I think that Jill needs to do better of communicating the organization's mission. And I think that also establishing communication structures is very important. I think that Jill needed to have a communication structure in place for how she was going to handle communication amongst the virtual team members, and also between the virtual team and the upper management team. I think this would have been very helpful in just handling day-to-day situations as well as the crisis situations faced in the case. And there's a lot of other things that the text talks about that could be considered. I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of these, but there's the public affairs and issues that could be considered, as discussed in 11.4.4, media relations in 11.4.11, and relationship marketing in 11.4.10. I think relationship marketing is important because Hockaday Responders obviously wants people to use their technology for long term, as it's a emergency response type technology is what I gathered. So I think that they definitely need to develop those relationships, and I'm not sure how strategic they were in doing that. And yes, I think that the virtual team communication should be handled differently than the communication with other outside stakeholders. The main difference is that the employees are employees, and they're not outside stakeholders that are using the technology, but they're the ones that are supposed to be making sure the technology operates properly. So that's where Hockaday Responders needs to do a good job communicating with their employees, communicating the vision, and communicating the goals of the company, and establishing those communication structures. Communication with outside stakeholders is probably a little bit more loose and doesn't involve so much structure. Also, the public may care about the organization's mission, but may not care a lot about the organization's goals. That's what the employees are going to be caring about and be motivated by, so I definitely think that communication should be handled differently between the virtual team members and the outside stakeholders. And then finally, our question 3 is, what mistakes would the text say, would our authors say that the Hockaday responders made? So, first of all, I'd say that the use of a one-way communication model with their employees was a big mistake. Section 11.2.1 discusses the one-way communication model and how for a lot of time organizations have used one-way communication for marketing, and I think other organizations have also used it for communicating with their employees. I think that Hockaday responders did this when they said, here's what your structure is going to be, you're going to operate in a virtual team, and you need to figure that out. They didn't provide a lot of communication and structure, they just expected them to figure it out, and mostly it was top-down communication rather than gathering input or involving the virtual team members in this decision. I think another mistake that they made was the low degree of stakeholder contact. Section 11.3.1 says that a high degree of stakeholder contact is critical for maintaining a viable business, and I think that the Hockaday responders didn't have a lot of contact with their stakeholders until the issues arose in the U.S. city. I think that they could have addressed the stakeholder concerns a lot sooner. They could have sent out a formal apology, letting everyone know what had happened, how and why it had happened, and what was being done to prevent it in the future. They could have also, that could have been a public thing where everyone, whether or not they were using the company's technology, could read it and see what was going on. And they also could have written some sort of letter or something to their stakeholders who were using the technology and kind of given them an outline of what they were doing to make sure that the situation didn't happen again. I think they could have done this right off the bat so that they weren't waiting until people directly addressed their concerns and asked them about it. They could have kind of prevented that in the first place. And also, the company did not use the SWOT analysis process in evaluating the changes when they decided to implement those. I think Section 11.3.4 talks a lot about that, and I think that the company could have done a lot better in analyzing the changes they were going to make and in implementing those changes by assessing the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I think that they definitely made a big mistake by not doing that in the first place. So that wraps up our case study for this week.